Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burak of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is Trace Meyer of RunToGold. Trace is an entrepreneur, investor, journalist, and monetary scientist. He holds a degree in accounting and a law degree from California Western School of Law. He has studied Austrian School Economics, focusing on the work of Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises. Thank you for joining us here today, Trace.
Thanks, Jason. Glad to be here.
Great. Now, Trace, you wrote the book, The Great Credit Contraction, a couple years ago, right? What's your view of the macroeconomic situation right now? Because we have this QE to infinity here, and we have the macroeconomic situation is different depending upon where you look. Because if you look at what the governments are doing, it looks to me like they're increasing their leverage, they're borrowing more, they're getting more credit, and the private sector, the small businesses, and the consumers are getting less credit. Their interest rates are going up. People are trying to delever like crazy. So what's your take on all of this?
Well, as I wrote in the book a few years ago with the Great Credit Contraction, this is you could say, equal and opposite reaction to the Great Credit Expansion. And what happened is about 500 years ago, the average person used gold or silver or some tangible commodity, whether it was cows or salt millennia ago, as their money or their currency. And over these 500 years, we've gone from holding the actual physical commodity in our hand to using a complete illusion, the U.S. dollar, euros, yen, whatever they are, these fiat currencies, coupled with fractional reserve banking. And all of this is pyramided out into a gigantic liquidity pyramid, which, pretty much everybody's kind of seen the liquidity pyramid that I made, though it's modeled after John Exeter's liquidity pyramid from the 70s when the gold and the dollar link was severed. And so during this Great Credit Expansion, we had all types of crazy exotic instruments, particularly derivatives. And since the Great Credit Contraction started, and that's the thesis in my book, is that it has actually begun, capital is now burrowing down the pyramid into safer, more liquid investments. And that capital, which doesn't move down fast enough, well, it was just illusory anyways, and it just goes poof, it evaporates into thin air. And we saw that when auction rate securities had their bids dry up. We've seen it with Lehman Brothers. And so really to get to your point or your question about QE to infinity, well, the nation states, the governments of the world, they're using their currencies, which are like their common stocks, and they're diluting them through a form of currency debasement through this quantitative easing. And they're doling out these newly created shares or, all of these fiat currency units to the banks. And so they're allowing the banks to take their assets, which are higher up in the liquidity pyramid, which have lost their real value, but they're not really marked to market. They're just marked to myth. And they're allowing them to put them to the Fed, and then the Fed gives them these new currency units. So they give them $100 billion worth of mortgage bonds or whatever that are only worth maybe full $100 billion, and that's how this wealth is getting transferred from holders of assets that are higher up in the liquidity pyramid to those that are able to move down the pyramid faster. But eventually, we're going to see this QE to infinity result in the worthlessness of these fiat currency units, because you can't just keep pushing buttons at the Fed and creating trillions and trillions and trillions of these units and not have them become worthless. And that's when the capital will move into gold or silver or other tangible assets which don't have counterparty risk and are limited in amount.
And it also looks to me, Trace, like the money itself has been completely destroyed, like you said. But when the Fed does these quantitative easing programs, it's really destroying the private sector. It's cannibalizing the private sector. They're destroying their own tax base. They're hurting the profit margins of the businesses that they need to take the taxes from. So in the short term, they continue government borrowing, increase government borrowing, keep the politicians in office, but in the long term, they're destroying their entire tax base. They're destroying the economy. They're not solving any of the long-term fundamental problems with the economy at all.
Yeah, and it's really kind of a testament to the resiliency of the free market that life as we know it is continuing to go on the way it is. despite all of the machinations that are going on. It's really kind of crazy when you look at everything they're doing. And I think a lot of that is because of the increased complexity of the economy, especially as we move into the information age, because the economy has this ability to route around a lot of the damage that they're causing. But like you said, they are killing the economy, or at least they're trying to. But humanity, we do have a lot of productivity. We do have a lot of capital, whether it's calculus that Isaac Newton came up with centuries ago, or whether it's a lot of the latest and greatest innovations. All of these things are human capital. We have lots of real estate that's already built. We have processes and ways of doing things. So, I mean, the economy is very resilient in that sense, but they're doing everything they can, it seems, to just screw it up. And they're all looting too. They're just taking as much as they can. And a system like that, because it interferes with the pricing mechanism to such a large degree, it is bound to fail. And so, what's on the other side of this? We don't necessarily know, but we do know that this can't continue going on the way it is.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And you mentioned looting, and I was going to bring up an Ayn Rand character piece. You have a bunch of Dagny Taggarts and a bunch of Henry Reardons who are trying and working harder than they've ever worked before just to keep their heads above water now, like in the private sector economy. And it's just getting worse and worse and worse and more difficult. More rules, more regulations, more taxes. Your profit margins are vanishing to a large extent due to inflation, and you can't pass the cost on to your customers because your customers, a lot of the money that they have is evaporating too.
Yeah, I completely agree with that sentiment. And there are also John Galts out there, and there are actually people who have mixed perhaps John Galt with Hank Rearden and Diaconia. And so the tools that we have now in the information age that allow us to play these multiple different roles that we see from that Atlas Shrugged movie, I think it would be incumbent upon a lot of people to, look at how they can play these different roles and compartmentalize their lives in ways that they can hang on to more of the fruits of their labor. Because we have tools available now in the information age that allow this to happen, and it allows us to do a lot of these things.
Yeah. So you would expect then that Ben Bernanke so far has managed to keep basically things in a stagflation type environment. He's printed all this money. He's doused everything in monetary gasoline, but there's been really no inflationary expectations, no velocity of money yet. I don't know how much longer he can keep things in stagflation before things go one way or the other, but I do know this, Trace, that gold is going to be the big winner here no matter which way things go, in my opinion, because I don't see anything else outperforming gold. I see gold gaining against the Dow. I see gold gaining against real estate, and I see gold gaining against other commodities too.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that to a point. Obviously, with my website RunToGold.com, I'm a big gold bug. But gold was actually I've come to think that there will actually be more upside with something like Bitcoin as opposed to gold for numerous reasons. Not that gold's not going to perform and help people protect their savings and whatnot, but in terms of where the needs of the market are solved and being able to route around all these things that happen, I think Bitcoin's a far superior instrument.
And is that because Bitcoin's more liquid and easier to transact in than gold right now is?
Yeah, that's precisely the reason. Like gold, for example, Bitcoin is to gold what math is to physics or chemistry. So really, all the advantages of gold, such as it being physical in the sense of being made out of atoms, that's actually one of its largest downfalls. because when it's physical, it has to be stored. It has to be somewhere. And as we mentioned earlier, governments, confiscation. Well, are they going to confiscate the physical gold, or are they just going to do it through tax policy? And I think that they'll actually do it through tax policy. And we're already seeing the opening salvos of this getting laid. We have hard currency controls. If you try to take $5 of pennies or nickels outside of the U.S. or you try to melt them, melt or export, 10 years in jail. So we've got hard currency controls with draconian penalties already. And you need to file FACTA. So if you have gold held with a third party, you have to file that on a FACTA. And the next thing is they're going to tax it. You know, maybe there will be a net worth tax or an unrealized capital gains tax that they try to implement. And all of these things, you know, it comes down to gold actually being physical and therefore having to exist somewhere. Whereas Bitcoin, on the other hand, because in my opinion, it's just as real and just as tangible as gold is. In fact, it might even be more real because it's constructed out of numbers and not out of atoms. And because it's constructed out of these numbers and it's based on cryptography and it runs over the Internet in a decentralized network, the largest decentralized network in the world, by the way, with over 300 petaflops. And the Department of Energy just came out with another supercomputer called Titan, which has 20 whole petaflops. So the Bitcoin network's already an order of magnitude larger than the Department of Energy's two largest supercomputers, which are 15 and 20 petaflops respectively. And so and with Bitcoin, it is liquid. And so when I look at this liquidity pyramid, capital is going to move into the safest and the most liquid assets. And so gold obviously is a very safe asset. It's nobody's liability. It's not subject to counterparty risk if you hold it properly. With a trusted third party, you know, because if you're going to be vaulting millions and millions of dollars worth of gold, you don't want to stick that under your bed, right? And so you can hold gold very safely and not be subject to these risks that are in the current banking and financial system. Well, Bitcoin has all of those same advantages. Like gold, it's an equity-based instrument. It's not anybody's liability. It's not subject to counterparty risk. If you see the Bitcoins in the blockchain, you know the quantity and the quality of the Bitcoins, so you don't have to worry about this tungsten in your gold bars like we recently saw in New York with the 10-ounce gold bars. So, and then Bitcoin is far superior in terms of liquidity. I was just at a conference down in Phoenix. It's the largest conference for the prepaid ATM industry. There were 800 people, you know, senior executives or whatnot, and ATMs and credit cards and prepaid cards. And we did a presentation. It was the first one of the show to these 800 people, and we sent $20,000 worth of Bitcoins from China to my mobile phone. And it can't be seized, it can't be confiscated, it can't be interfered with, and it can be done in a completely anonymous way, just like you can be transferring gold, except you don't have to worry about customs agents. And so in terms of wealth generation, I think Bitcoin's going to be far superior to gold because it allows the market to route around all of this damage being caused by the politicians.
That's a very good point, Trace, and I think our listeners definitely need to take a look at Bitcoin. And as opposed to a gold standard, which I think a gold standard would be good, but I actually prefer the competing currencies because I don't think anyone should have a monopoly on money, and I think the market should decide what's the best form of money by their vote.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. You know, I do think that the principle of sound money, you know, as Mises says, it's a bulwark against despotic inroads on the part of government. It belongs in the same classes as constitutions and bills of right. And so having gold and silver legal tender in the U.S. Constitution, I think that, you know, is, well, it doesn't say that we have to use gold or silver, that the states even have to use gold or silver, because that's really what it's about. It's a prohibition on the states. So there's no jurisdiction or authority in the Constitution that allows the federal government to make anything legal tender, period. They can't make Federal Reserve notes legal tender. That's unconstitutional. It'll never hit the Supreme Court. But they can't even make gold or silver legal tender. It's up to the states because it's really a property rights issue and a contract issue and a tort issue. So if the states make anything legal tender, it can only be gold and silver. That's what's in the Constitution. And I think, for the most part, that's good. And then having these gold and Bitcoin, they already trade. They're both free-floating exchange rates and whatnot against other currencies. And so if people want to exchange their gold into Bitcoins, they'd be able to do that. And so having these competing currencies, I think, is a good thing. And Bitcoin's just smashing open the door because Western Union, they just released earnings expectations, and their stock plummeted 26%. And eBay just laid off 325 employees and 120 independent contractors. Bitcoin entrepreneurs, their business is booming. They're making all types of money, and they're hiring. So that's what's exciting, is that freedom is profitable, not just freedom in the monetary space, which is pretty much brand new because the governments, because they do control the payment mechanisms, Visa, MasterCards, PayPal's, the banking systems, SWIFT, the wire transfers, all of that, they're able to really abuse their paper franchises. But now they've got themselves a competitor. They've got Bitcoin, and Bitcoin's going to continue sucking in more capital as the costs of the current system keep rising. Those costs in terms of time, in terms of money, and in terms of privacy. And Bitcoin really is a lot cheaper on all three counts than the current system. And so I see it continuing to be adopted. And the more these regulators and governments try to intervene and screw stuff up, the more value proposition Bitcoin offers. For example, down in Argentina, they're adding a 15% tax if you use your credit card outside of Argentina. So, now people are starting to route around all of that, trading their pesos for Bitcoins, etc., and then getting their capital outside of Argentina that way. So it's very exciting to see this development happen in the payment space.
You've made a very strong argument, Trace, why people should at least start doing some research on Bitcoin and adding it into their portfolio, at least for working capital or some liquidity purposes, in addition to their gold and their silver holdings. As we change topics here to personal liberty, you talked earlier in the interview about gold and silver potentially either being confiscated or for tax purposes. What are some of the other rights that you see people losing very quickly? Because there's a whole long list of them. And there was a book came out that came out in the last year or two where people don't even realize this here in the United States, but they're committing 3 or 4 felonies a day. So what is your opinion on all this? Are we just going to end up being cows that can continue to be milked more and more, or are eventually going to become beef cows?
Well, I think that I think it's going to depend a lot on what individuals do to protect themselves, because freedom and liberty, it's something that has to bubble up from the people. And the way I see it, at least with the information age and the tools of the information age, and the way that governments and everything have been reacting to it, is that this freedom is going to become increasingly a luxury good, meaning that you're going to have to be able to pay for it. You're going to have to be able to pay for your freedom or pay for your liberty. And if you're not able to pay for it, then you're not going to get it, and you're going to be milked, and you're going to be turned into a beef cow. And when we look at liberty and when we look at freedom, we have 3 distinct time frames. We've got the past, the present, and the future. And the future is represented by our life interest. That's why we shouldn't murder people, because it's bad. It eliminates their ability to exercise their agency in the future. And the present, that's why slavery or involuntary servitude is bad. Being able to detain people without due process, that's why it's bad. And theft or taxation or things of this nature, that's taking the fruits of people's labors. That's how they exercise their choices in the past. Well, all 3 of these have pretty much been decimated. It started with the Federal Reserve and the governments having control over the property and then the income tax, and that's how the property interest has been eroded. And now they're just able to do it with impunity with this QE to infinity. And with the National Defense Authorization Act, the U.S. government's claiming the ability to detain people indefinitely, both U.S. citizens and non-U.S. citizens, without access to a trial or an attorney or being able to challenge their detention. So there goes that liberty interest in the present. And then Obama has started ordering assassinations of innocent children with drones. For example, Tariq Aziz, he was 16 years old, and he went around photographing children who've been killed in drone strikes in Pakistan. He presented these photographs to the Bureau of Investigative Journalists at a conference in Islamabad, and 3 days later, Obama had him targeted and assassinated, along with his 12-year-old cousin. Merely for his political speech on showing how the drone strikes are killing other innocent children. A second example would be Anwar al-Awlaki's son. Anwar, obviously a very bad dude, but still not even charged with a crime. He was killed in a drone strike, and 2 weeks later in a separate incident, his son, who was 16 and a U.S. citizen, who wasn't even accused of being a member of Al-Qaeda or anything else, was targeted and assassinated merely because he could grow up and be upset because his dad got killed. So, I mean, it's absolutely insane that these institutions are assassinating innocent children. And so if anybody thinks that they really have any of these freedoms or liberties left, well, the curtain's getting pulled back pretty quickly. And in order to protect yourself, I think people have to really acquaint themselves with cryptography, and they have to learn how to disintermediate themselves from the current system as much as they can. And that's one reason I like Bitcoin so much, is because it really allows people to take control of their property interests. Because you can have a private key to your Bitcoin wallet that has only existed ever inside your brain. You know, never existed on a computer, nowhere. And with that, you could control millions of dollars worth of Bitcoins that could never be seized or confiscated. And it's truly a form of sovereign wealth.
It sounds more airtight than a secret Swiss bank account.
It is, because the Swiss, they roll over. You know, they roll over and their accounts can be hacked, and the bankers that work for them deliver the tax records to the Germans. And there are actually a bunch of what are called black accounts, and these are where the EU tax regulators are closing in on French citizens or whoever who have their money stashed in the Swiss bank accounts, and they're black, meaning they haven't paid their taxes on them. And so it's just a matter of time before those people get caught up in tax evasion or whatever it is. And so the only way they can really get their money out of those accounts is to withdraw cash and then drive it somewhere. And so now we got these cash-sniffing dogs at the border to Italy and Switzerland and things like that. And, you know, you can't sniff a Bitcoin. I mean, yeah, it's used to buy things that you can sniff, from what I've heard. But at the end of the day, you can't sniff a Bitcoin. There's really no way to know it even exists without someone, you know, if you take proper measures, there's no way to know that you own or control a particular Bitcoin or not. And it's the most sovereign form of wealth I can think of, because you know, even gold is sovereign, but it's still physical, and that means if somebody with a bigger gun comes and tries to take it from you, then they're going to be able to do it. Not that somebody couldn't compel you to turn over your private key somehow, but it's, you know, a lot less likely, in my opinion, particularly for the average person who doesn't have millions of dollars worth of Bitcoins. You know, if you're like me and you only got 1 or 2 Bitcoins, well, the private key to 1 or 2 Bitcoins, then, you know, you're not really that big of a target, and you're not a very good cow to come and milk or try to turn into beef.
Very good. As we wrap up the interview here, Trace, tell our listeners more about your book and your websites and any other products you can offer them.
Yeah, I've got the book, The Great Credit Contraction, which gives an outline or an overview of where we're at and how we got here and kind of where I think we should be moving. And then there's RunToGold.com. That's where you can find the book. I've also got a bunch of products available at HowToVanish.com. Anywhere from knowing where to optimize your state income tax and how to do that to just general privacy tips. In our book, we weigh the costs and the benefits. And then since we've talked about Bitcoin quite a bit, I've got a free Bitcoin guide, which you can get at freebitcoinguide.com. And that will show people how to kind of reduce the learning curve when it comes to Bitcoin and things like that. And, of course, all of the products are available for sale in Bitcoin, because if somebody doesn't want to have the credit card transaction that's associated with a How to Vanish book, which I don't blame them, like, why not buy it with Bitcoin that you went and got with cash? So I show people how to do that, because I don't take their time or their attention or their privacy for granted, because I think anybody who's involved in kind of this liberty movement, they should be willing to accept Bitcoin. And if they don't, then in effect they're becoming an informant for the state, because the state can go get credit card records. They can go get your PayPal records. They don't even need a subpoena to do it. But with Bitcoin, it's not tied to your identity. So I think if people really begin disintermediating as much as they can from the current system, it will be very helpful for them in the future, because we don't know how all of these records are going to be used. They're all database, tracked, archived, stored. They're searchable for eternity. We don't know how that's going to be used in the future. So, really just don't have your transactions show up there in the first place.
Some great points, and I think that's some very sobering things for our listeners to consider, because we still have some people here, a lot of Americans who have not woken up yet, and they're going to come to a very painful reality that basically they're in serfdom right now, and it's only going to get worse.
Yeah, and the thing is like, you can break that serfdom. There's now, with Bitcoin, like, it's here. I mean, there's nothing I can think of that is more of a kryptonite dagger to the state, more of a key to unlock the chains that bind you. Because when you have your capital in a bank account, or if you're even storing it in U.S. dollars, in effect, you're allowing them to pyramid out and fractional reserve all of that stuff, and that allows them to craft the very chains that bind you. Like, why do you pay for that? I don't understand. And yet Bitcoin's been around for years now, and more people haven't really adopted it. And there's nothing like the power of the purse that changes people's behavior. And so, if your merchants that you deal with don't accept Bitcoin, well, you can stop using them.
Well, it appears that Bitcoin's getting to a tipping point now, because it's starting to become more well-known. There's more conferences, and it sounds like more businesses are going to start to accept it. So then maybe Bitcoin will become more widely used, and more people will start adopting it after that.
Yeah, and that's what's going to be really exciting, because the more capital that flows into Bitcoin, the higher the price is going to go, the more attention it'll attract, the more people begin using and accepting it. It's so costly for the state to try and do anything to stop it. The European Central Bank just wrote a report about it and basically just shrugged their shoulders about how to possibly stop it. So, freedom's going to have to boil up from the people, and I can't think of a more important place for people to really assert their freedom than in their financial transactions. It's fun and games until you start starving somebody of the capital that they need. The banks, when you start starving the banks of the capital that they need, then things are really going to start to change.
Exactly, and the last two real votes people have, and I'm not talking about voting in election for politicians, the last two real votes people have are to vote with their money and to vote with their feet. Yeah,
and vote with your actions, Like, if you saw Atlas Shrugged too, Hank Rearden, Diaconia was talking to him about, you produce the very steel that builds your own prison. Like, why do you keep producing it? And so, if you can go John Galt, from producing the steel, but yet have economic activity that's going on in Bitcoin, you're able to kill two birds with one stone that way.
That's great. In wrapping up the interview, Trace, I just want to thank you for your time, and hopefully we can have you back on soon with any other developments in the macroeconomic situation. You can come in here and comment on them.
Oh, yeah. Love to, Jason. Thanks for the interview.
Great.